my only interaction with St. Bernard, my aunt had one in Germany, and she lived on a farm, so like a farm dog and just did whatever we wanted. It was a little bit different. She was fun to take. She was a good boar dog.
Have a good day, everybody.
You know, I think, you know, the main reason they were raised, of course, is to be outside, digging up people that are buried in avalanches and things. So.
Yeah, I think she was in a good spot being on that farm. All that shit though.
Well, so today we're doing Kant. I might as well get started because Hannah's not here, and so this is hopefully. If it looks like it goes off, give me a holler. I got 2 extra batteries. That's the one thing about that camera. It doesn't give me a warning that it's going to shut off. But I mean, you can look up Kant. There's tons of stuff on the internet on Kant. In fact, I spent some time last night wondering. You know, I've got lots of stuff about Hume's tomb, Locke's tomb, Newton's tomb. You know, you can find all kinds. Where's his tomb? His tomb was bombed to hell during World War II. So he's got nothing. As far as I know, there's no leftover remnants of. It was in a cathedral that was totally smashed, and his house. So this is kind of I thought was interesting. It's not really the house he lived in. They haven't really, as far as I know, done anything to it. As you could read here, that you know it's in Russia basically. So
it's in Kleiner.
So they've promised to open it and create a museum and like maybe a nice area for people to have conferences and things of that sort, a museum and so on. But so far, nothing has actually been accomplished as far as, like, you know, they say. Of course, you know, is it updated? I don't know.
I can see that because Leningrad is that Russian exclave that used to be Königsberg, Germany, that they lost after W2, and they don't really like to acknowledge that it used to be Germany. I think building
well, they do. Like,
apparently,
according to this, both the Russians and the Germans are fond of Kant, and I could see that because we're all Kantians today. If you're in the West, in the academic environment, Kant is a stage where basically the modern period, you know, now takes off. So there's variants after Kant, but everyone accepts his basic solution to Hume's situation. Where we left off with David Hume, Rousseau was kind of went off track for a little bit because of the time. You know, if we were following historical sequence, but Rousseau doesn't do much with Hume, and as far as he doesn't do much on metaphysics. He just wrote popular books, basically. But Kant is going to respond to Hume, and so up until Kant's awakening, in a sense, he was woken from his dogmatic slumbers. That's the line he used, which is actually in the text. If you read the Prolegomena, the syllabus says the critique we're looking at, but famously he wrote the critique and no one could figure out what the heck he was talking about, all of his friends and everything else. So he went back to the writing desk and wrote the Prolegomena, which means read this first, to kind of explain what the heck he's trying to do in the critique. The first critique, there were 3 critiques: critique of pure reason, and the critique of practical judgment, I believe, and then the last one was the critique of aesthetics or aesthetic judgment, or critique of judgment. I should go to here. Critique of Pure Reason, 1787. You kind of try to plug this stuff into your mind date-wise. It's kind of important. I keep in mind that Hegel was born in 1770. So the first critique is published when Hegel is 17 or 18, somewhere around there. It takes a while, really, for it to pervade the academic space. So when we think of Hegel's generation as reacting to who they called Vater Kant, Father Kant, it was already in at least his mid-20s or so. And then Kant comes out with the critique of practical reason. I don't know why they don't give that in German, because it's kind of interesting. And then the critique of judgment was art, aesthetics, purpose. So those are the critiques, and those are pretty famous and still highly recommended. Kant is often considered to be very difficult. I don't think the reading of Kant is that difficult. I just don't think very many people do it. But the ideas of Kant are what's difficult. So in a sense, if you're leaving the common sense view that I think is typical of American, the American common sense, is I associate with John Locke. So basically we accept that there's stuff out there, it's real, it's made out of matter, so you can't kick it and make it go away. Like Samuel Johnson's, I refute Berkeley thus. That's just an easy way to think of it. That's real stuff out there, and you can't just wish it were otherwise. But at the same time, we don't really see it in any sense as it is in itself, although I don't think most Americans worry about that. We think of things as looking the way they do. Although when we start reflecting on that, we realize that it's the way we see it. So it appears to us. And part of why it appears to us that way is because of the kind of eyesight we have, and we, especially thanks to glasses and eye care, especially in the U.S., we know that different individuals can see things differently, etc. My wife's eyes are such and such, and my daughter has synesthesia, so there's all kinds of interesting differences. I have a colleague who's colorblind, and we kind of torture him, because of that, because that's just the thing you do to people that are colorblind. That's a nice way to treat a friend, out of love of the friend. That's how you do it. It's friendly teasing and stuff. But the more you analyze this difficulty, the more you realize with Berkeley and then Hume that, gee, that actually means we can't know the way the world is objectively. Everything that we know is subjective. So there's that limitation. And that makes you wonder, well, gee, but how do we get along so well? How do we accomplish what we do? Because absolutely amazing. I was trying to understand it this morning, but the Nobel Prize in physics was just awarded to two guys, one Japanese, one I don't know where, who have either together or individually learned to use light as tools, so they could use light as tweezers. Have you?
Oh,
did you hear?
I'd like to see this.
So it's kind of kind of cool. Nobel Prize in physics. Yeah, so there was supposed to be a Japanese guy. Well, but it was according to the paper.
Is there a video of these light tweezers?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to see.
Let's get rid of this.
So they've somehow given light more physical properties.
I would think heat, something to do with heat. Laser isolator. Well, that's, I could use that. Optical physicists. I didn't get mine.
Yeah, I figured it was something to do with lasers.
So, I mean, that's an example of just how incredible modern science is. So, it's absolutely the case that we're able to manipulate the objective world. So even though theoretically we're trapped in a model that tells us all of our knowledge is subjective, all of our experience, all the phenomena that we gather from all of our different sources are subjective, and that, you know, and so if I'm using a tool, the kind of material or data that I'm gathering with that tool, that telescope, is going to be subjective to the characteristics of that tool. So if I send a new telescope out into orbit and use it to study the stars, it's going to be able to give me a picture of the universe within the parameters of the tool itself. So if there's limitations to the tool, and you can't imagine a tool that has absolutely no limitations, it'd be no, you can't imagine that, then basically if it comes back and says, yes, everything looks like this, you realize, of course, without even saying it, that, well, there might be other stuff that we're totally oblivious to because we didn't make a tool to see it. Same way we don't hear sounds that giraffes make because we don't hear in the range that giraffes make their noises and so on. There's all kinds of information available in the space that we're in that we're not aware of because, of course, we've evolved in order to interact with certain aspects of our environment, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in a subjective theoretical knowledge space, and yet at the same time, how do we explain the fact that we can do so much so well? We must be gathering information about the objective world that's out there. And then the other thing, of course, is that we're social beings and we can communicate this. We're not solipsistically trapped in our own world where I don't really know what John's thinking because John can tell me and I can know that that's what he was thinking and so on, right? You know, that's even emails. You send me emails, I believe you, right? You know, and so on. So how do we fix our theory? How do we get out of this theoretical trap that Hume has set for us? And that's what Kant is really trying to do. Give us an argument that explains why metaphysics, this theoretical explanation of how we know things and what things there are, what really exists, can be salvaged after Jung basically says it's hopeless. There's no way of knowing any of this stuff. And Kant's answer is to totally flip the problem that we've had ever since the Greeks. And this he refers to as himself as the Copernican revolution in thought, which, keeping in mind that Copernicus flipped the view that the Earth is the center of the cosmos to the view that the sun is actually the center. It seems just the opposite, really, that Kant really screwed up his metaphor, because instead of saying that that the center of our universe is somewhere else, what Kant actually says is the problem has always been our own human nature, that we're perceiving things through a human nature, and that human nature gives us the parameters of our experience, right? What I was just saying is that what structures our experience is the tool we're using, and the tool that we've always been using, of course, being human, is the human frame of reference, right? And so what Kant argues then is that all of the things that Aristotle ever since Aristotle, we're doing categorical thinking, categorical statements, and so on. But if you recall, studying Aristotle, his categories include things that must be the case associated with things. So things have to have time, they have to have space, they have to have matter, substance, and then they can be broken down into other categories. So there's different divisions and so on. So for example, substance, everything that exists must have substance, says Aristotle. And then we can break them down into things like how much. Everything has quantity, everything has qualities, relationships, so quality, everything has this, etc. And so he breaks them down into 10 categories, of relationships and things, etc. So if you go back and you look at how Aristotle gave us the categories, but what Aristotle was arguing was that those categories apply to the things themselves. Kant turns that around and says, strictly speaking, the things in themselves, the objects that give us the real world, don't have any of those categories. They're categories imposed by our perspective on things. So those categories are not things associated with the world, those are categories that are associated with our frame of knowledge, right? So that's the revolution, right? Now if you think about it, comparing it to Copernicus, it's just the opposite, because instead of saying the world is really centered out there, he's saying the world is centered right here. The way the world is the way I perceive it, and I agree with you. I'm solipsistically trapped in my mind, but what enables me to have a shared world experience with you and others is because your frame, if you're rational, and there's always that little difficulty, right, is the same as mine. And that's why we can share experiences and talk about the colors that we're experiencing and the taste. You know, oh, this is a good tea. You know, you want to try some. Do you have lemon with this tea? No, you never have lemon with this tea, etc. Right? You know, so why is it that we have that shared kind of experience? It's because, of course, we're the same rational human beings, and so things look to us the same. They sound to us the same, and it's not just that. Instead, we have there's our nice table, right? I was looking, you could get a table like that for Aristotle too. Though keep in mind that there's multiple levels of categories associated with really both of them. But if we look at these, notice the so-called aporias, or the problems that the Greeks had, like between the problem of the one and the many, very confusing for the Greeks. How can everything be one? The universe is one, yet at the same time there's many. You know, and the same thing with this chair is one thing, but it has many parts. Confused the Greeks. Whether it really confused them or not, at least in their literature, they were confused because they couldn't figure out how could something be both one and many. Well, thanks to Kant, so 1787, right, we're now aware that the reason this weird problem, this paradox appears to us, is not because things are both one and many. It's because everything that we experience as one thing, and I can do that with one class, one desk, one classroom, one world. Everything I experience, I can break down into these categories, right? So it doesn't mean that I'm confused about how something can have both characteristics. Everything has all of these characteristics, because that's the framework that I'm carrying around with me by being human, that enables me to see everything. And space. Don't forget space and time. Everything must also have space and time. So if I usually will draw some sort of I used to draw kind of a thing. Maybe I'll put this up for a minute so I can demonstrate my artistic put on light. So if I think of this as the phenomenon, oh, it's red, terrible. No help for it. Basket. Stuff. So phenomena, which is, remember, we're a lantern. We're carrying our lantern around, and it's the reflection of our own lantern that gives us our experience. So phenomena is the Greek word that they begin using here for all of what I perceive. But at the same time, there has to be the thing in itself. Which I believe Locke used that expression, the things in themselves. But it becomes kind of a formal term, which, by the way, is also referred to as noumena. So phenomena is what I can experience. Noumena are all the things that we assume must be out there, even though we can't actually experience them. Because of, as Locke explains, and Hume picks up on it, and Berkeley did too, that you can't actually know those things. But we transcend this limitation. So what Kant calls this is his transcendental method. So transcendental method. It's transcending the limit of phenomena by logically saying what must be the case in order for us to have phenomena. And for me to experience objects, they have to exist. So, and remember in German, it's das Ding an sich. That's kind of fun. If you go to cocktail parties, you've got your German phrase of the week, das Ding an sich, right? And it was funny, I was at a cocktail party and used the expression das Ding an sich, and actually had a German tell me, no, it's in sich, or whatever. And I said, no, it's on sich. And this German person actually had to go and look it up and came back to me and said, yes, you're right. It is on sich. So if you read enough German philosophy, you know it's das Ding an sich. It's not my fault. It's peculiar, I suppose, right? But you also have God. And God, again, is not phenomena that we can actually experience, but we can transcend this limit and say that morality wouldn't be real unless there was a God. So even though Kant will argue with Hume that arguments for the existence of God do not work, he does actually, in a sense, use his own argument. It's not meant to be absolutely persuasive, but basically he says if you believe morality exists, and Kant absolutely feels it does, then there must be a God, because otherwise morality makes no sense. Anything is permissible without God, right? And we'll see, of course, how Europeans will play with that as we go. But so God must exist. By the way, did you ever used to go up the hill at APU? Because the first building on the left at APU used to have, on the big blue surface, had a big image of the world that would light up at night. And next to it, they had a phrase which said, the two things that are most wonderful is the moral order within, and the, I guess, the stars without, or something. You know, what was that phrase? Let's see. Kant quote: "The moral law within me. Two things fill the mind." Here we go. I didn't have the whole quote there, but two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often it steadily reflect upon them. The star, okay, so this was the quote that was on the wall of the building. The starry heavens above and the moral law within. So I was at APU. And they took it off. And I was waiting to see what they were going to put up, and they never put up anything. So basically, that Kant's quote is just gone. Verschwindet, actually. And then, also numinous, is the I, the ego. Ego is just a Latin concept of the I, right? There's also the id, which is kind of an internal I. It's kind of confusing, I suppose, at least to me. What happens is the Freudian view of this is that the id is like the little desires inside of my body that kind of drive me, and the society becomes the super ego, the big self, big brother, if you will, right? That imposes behavioral restrictions on the id, which end up becoming the ego. So this is kind of the self-controlled self instead of the hidden agenda that my body wants the pizza. Myself says, these folks will tell me that that's too fattening and I shouldn't get fatter because then they won't like me, so I won't eat the pizza. You know, at least not while they're looking, right? You know, or something like that, you know. So that's Freud, though.
For me, that's where Godzilla sits there, stomps on Bambi and says, now I will eat the pizza.
I understand. I have the same shape. And we are all alike in the sense that we know that if we have this shape, it's because we do the same things. At roughly the same ages, right? You know, it's just,
Yeah.
you know. But so the ego for Kant is outside of phenomena, and that's the same Hume's reason that I can't see the subjective side. The subject is always having the experience, can never step out of itself in order to observe itself. So the ego is, in that sense, invisible. And yet, says Kant, it has all of these things that we can all experience together. Time, says Kant. Everything I experience with time as kind of this unfolding sense. You know, that I can't have even just a dream or an abstract thinking period about math or something without feeling like time is going on, right? So time is absolutely essential. Aristotle says the same thing too, right? So this is just Kant adapting his model, how the old models all fit into his new model, right? Then the other thing is space. But the thing about space, there is a limit on space, and that is that abstract ideas take up no space. So I don't think of triangularity as actually existing any place. I don't think of love in its abstract sense as being any particular place in the universe, right? So they exist in time, but they're not taking up physical space. Things that take up physical space are things that have shapes and actually have to be somewhere. And in order to do that, they actually have to take up a physical space, right? So both time and space are requirements for our experience. But an important part of this is that I'm, again, the focus of time for me. So you know, as we even still argue today, how do I know my sense of time is the same as yours? You know, if I'm having a good time, time seems to go fast for me. If it's boring for you, it seems to go slow for you. If I'm on a jet, you know, flying at a certain speed, and I come back, my watch seems to have slowed down a little bit compared to yours on the Earth, right? So literally, it seems like real calculable time, unless depends on my experience, what I'm doing, how fast I am going, and so on. So, by the way, you can think of Kant's theory here fitting very well with Einstein, for example. So Einstein's theory of relativity, and it builds on Kant fairly well. I still think Einstein's secret source is Leibniz, but at the same time, notice that Kant uses Leibniz. Kant's very much had been a rationalist based on Leibniz before he read David Hume. So all of this is really just his is taking his old framework, remapping it onto a point of view that reverses, you know, where this framework is situated. So instead of being situated in the world, it's situated in the mind, but it's basically the same. You know, he's just flipped it, right? So time and space, the old traditional experiences, yes, we have them, but even space is not out there. It's my projection of out there. So this magic marker is, you know, if I take this away from the space but concentrate on the space that the magic marker took up, I notice that that space is still there for me. And so how can that be when this is actually moved? It's because space is arranged by me, not by the things that are out there, right? So I suppose the point, you know, you keep going back to is that I'm the center, and I love how if we draw the Einstein cone, space-time cone, notice that I'm right here. I'm the center of the universe from Einstein's model of how we draw that. So I'm thinking of time and space from my here and now, right? And by the way, you can I should pull this down and show models of multiple time-space cones all interacting with one another. It's just sort of a frivolous design, but you get the impression that so you know, here's yours over here. Here's another one over here. You know, they're all kind of nested close to one another. And the reason we have fairly common historical experiences and so on is because of how close the centers of our universes are and stuff. So you know, that's an Einsteinian, you know, just a image that goes with this. So the other thing here is, you know, where do we put all these categories? So quantity, quality. Quantity, of course, is how much. And if you look at the chart that we have in the Prolegomena, since I'm on this page. Well, how is pure mathematics possible? How is pure natural science possible? How is metaphysics in general possible? How is metaphysics as a science possible? All of these are questions he's got to pose in response to David Hume, etc. I'm looking for the chart. I always end up looking for the chart. There it is. So this, if you have your books, it's page 805. So it's the logical table of the understanding, the judgment, etc. So when we're talking about quantity, it breaks it down to universal, that's everything, particular, individual things, but then singular. As to quality, and that's, you know, always since Aristotle, quality has been referred to as affirmative or negative.
What does that mean, quality is affirmative or negative?
So yes or no. So for example, when you're looking at arguments or statements, so if I say all horses are animals, the quantity is universal and the quality is affirmative. If I look at no horses are carnivores, right, the statement is a universal because it's talking about all horses. None of them are carnivores. And by the way, no carnivores are horses, right? But it's also, in quality, it's negative because it's denying that there's
Any.
right? You know, so So you might wonder, well, what's quality mean? It's always been referred to as whether you're affirming a relationship or denying a relationship. Modes and so on. So basically taking all of the old things, but then remapping them from this other perspective is pretty much. So you just fill this in. It's kind of interesting that Kant comes up with 12 categories, whereas the tradition has 10 for Aristotle, and this same particular set of assets. Although for Aristotle, the one category is space, or not space, sorry, substance. And so everything has to have substance. Kant doesn't say that. So that's kind of interesting.
So are these categories within quantity and quality?
No, quantity and quality are one.
Those are
Right,
categories
but then you
themselves.
have other ones as two relations. So the other ones that we have, substances is one of them, but you can also, but it doesn't mean that everything has to have substance. But then you have cause, community, necessity, existence, possibility.
Okay.
So now, but personally, I don't think specifically what goes into the categories are that significant, because they're not exactly the same. They're close. What Kant's doing with Aristotle is making use of those, but the reason I don't think it's that significant is because this whole thing is going to collapse almost immediately, because the very next generation turns around and finds it inadequate, and will basically conclude. I'll just say where it goes. Is that what creates these categories that enables us to share experience with one another is much bigger. It's language, it's culture, and so on. So when you're actually trying to figure out what gives us the categories of understanding, it becomes our whole language. The way we perceive things are the words. So if you share the vocabulary, you're going to share the experience of that vocabulary, right? You might be able to find that these kinds of categories still kind of, form a nice structure, that you can place all of the other ones in, but you're just playing a game when you're doing that. Because different people like Noam Chomsky and others can come along and just completely remap it. What's universal? Says Chomsky, actually, is there a universal grammar that all humans share? All human languages share. Says Chomsky, yes. Says practically everyone else, no. So, and that's a contemporary fight, that you could look at between, for example, Everett is one. What's his first name? Peter Everett, I forget. He's the one that literally goes and lives in the Amazon with the natives there, examining their culture, their language, and comes back and says, no, they don't have these kinds of characteristics. Noam Chomsky, and of course everyone just critiques him, and Chomsky's, what does he know? He's not sitting in the library studying all the time. He's just sitting in the woods trying to keep snakes from eating him and his family, which is just true, actually.
You said Chomsky thought there was something universal for all human language?
Yes.
What did you think was universal?
The structure of the underlying grammatical arrangements of things. So how does that go?
And no one else agreed with him?
Well, there are, you take sides.
For the sake of argument.
Is this camera still on? We didn't check it.
It's good.
It's good.
Thanks.
So it's spoken language he's talking about, not like body language or.
Right.
I imagine it was grammar.
So I don't recall him ever talking about body language.
Because I'm sure some body language is somewhat universal, maybe.
Right, right. But he's a linguistics professor at MIT. He's kind of sort of retired. I don't know what he's actually teaching right now. But he spends lots of time traveling all over the place, giving very highly political speeches. He's an exemplar of the extreme left. I mean, so far left.
You come back around?
Well, you know, that's kind of interesting because Chomsky's gone so far to the left that he's created a new niche over there that it doesn't come around. It's like a little, you know, popped out of the circle, way out there on the left. You know, it's kind of famous. Yeah, and that has nothing to do with what made him famous as a linguistics professor and this theory. You know, it's like, okay, he's brilliant. He can talk a mile a minute with a great sense of certitude about his data because he knows so much, and yet at the same time, his point of view is totally non-practical in that.
And that's Noam Chomsky or
Noam Chomsky. The other one I mentioned as kind of a competitor with him. This goes way back to the 70s. He's really old. He's in his late 80s, I would guess. Let me just click on Chomsky. I'm looking at.
It was up there at the top.
It was. Let's click on Chomsky. So 1928. So how old does that make him? 89.
We said 28.
And yet he has a young wife, by the way.
Trophy wife?
Well, 1949?
No. 20 years.
Well, young in comparison to him.
Yeah, remember, I'm old too, so when I talk young wife, I'm looking at 20 years to me. When you see pictures of them, it looks like, you know, this frail old guy standing next to what ought to be his daughter, but instead is, and he's the one with the big smile always. You know? It's kind of like his little, that's it. So he's been anti-Vietnam, etc. He was always in the anti-effort. He was always
Radical.
Yeah, never physically violent, but I believe often arrested.
He described himself as a libertarian socialist.
How does that work?
Kind of farther left than Bernie, you know.
Yeah.
Even.
I'm trying to grasp
figured it
libertarian
out.
I
socialism.
thought libertarian was more
So-called
right.
Socialism turns into communism, which in itself falls in on itself because the guys at the top, or gals, take all the means, and
I
take all
mean,
the power, and then they enforce
his
their laws.
interest is that everybody gets a
Yeah.
fair shake, everybody should have equal everything.
No, it doesn't work.
No, but that doesn't stop him
Because human
from
nature
arguing.
steps in, and greed, and
Because he comes in
hunger
and
for
everybody
power
that
and
doesn't
control.
agree with him is basically evil because of
Yeah.
the,
So everyone should be equal as long as they agree with him.
Yeah.
yes, yes. I realize I'm being totally unfair
Hail to the king.
to Noam Chomsky. I mean, if you
Again.
want to form your own opinion, please read or watch some of his stuff. He's prolific. He's out there. Lots of forums.
So you said he's a libertarian socialist?
Yes, that's what he refers to himself as.
I thought, I guess I
Like,
kinda
no,
thought
libertarians
that.
don't necessarily have to follow on the right side of the spectrum.
Well,
You like anarcho-libertarians.
like, you get these guys, they go, oh, we need to do this and do that, you know, and we're already $21 billion in debt, and they want to sit there, well, everyone should have free college. Well, who's going to pay for that?
Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, as we continue our interview with Noam Chomsky, world-renowned dissident linguist and author now in Tucson at the University of Arizona. I asked him about a recent mix-up on Fox and Friends in which the hosts thought they were interviewing former Democratic congressional candidate, a current one, Ann Kirkpatrick of Arizona, who supports Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency known as ICE. But in fact, they were actually speaking to a Massachusetts Democratic congressional candidate, Barbara L'Italienne, who opposes ICE. Here is how the interview started.
Good morning. I'm actually here to speak directly to Donald Trump. I feel that what's happening at the border is wrong. I'm a mother of four, and I believe that separating kids from their parents is illegal and inhumane.
On mass media obsession.
My frank opinion is that I must say I don't pay much attention to television, so I don't know a great deal about it. But in general, I think the media, first of all, the Fox News is by now basically a joke. It's, as you said, state media. The other media, I think, are focusing on issues which are pretty marginal. There are much more serious issues that are being put to the side. The worst of, even on the case of immigration, once again, I think the real question is dealing with the roots of immigration, our responsibility for it, and what we can do to overcome that. And that's almost never discussed, but I think that's the crucial issue. And I think we find the same across the board. So of all Trump's policies, the one that is the most dangerous and destructive, in fact poses an existential threat, is his policies on climate change, on global warming. That's really destructive. We're facing an imminent threat, not far removed, of enormous
It's just an intent
well, you get the idea.
to make you feel free.
If you're interested, he's out
No,
there.
I'm saying that the image.
Yeah.
But I brought him up as an example of someone who, in this linguistics niche, is still arguing that there's a physical characteristic in human brains that structures language, no matter which one it is, in these basically similar universal ways. And by the way, recursion is one of his, as far as I know, he's the one that brought it up, which is, I think, fantastic. The idea that all human languages are recursive. Have I mentioned that before? Recursion? Recursion is, if you look it up on Google, it's funny, because Google will ask you, did you mean recursion? And if I ask,
Yeah, we talked about this.
yeah, if I ask, so I'm looking for recursion, it'll come up and say, did you mean recursion? And it'll just keep doing that, because that's,
Yeah,
that's an example of recursion. Yeah, so, and by the way, as far as I know, it does seem to be the case that other animals, even though they might have utterances or even signs that they use that indicate, have meaningful characteristics so that they can communicate with one another. My dog, other birds, I'm sure communicate, etc. The idea that there's actually an ability to be recursive does seem to be human. And that's where we can talk about what we just said. We can talk about what we just said when we were talking about what we just said. So we can just basically create an infinity of communications because of our ability to incorporate previous things into new, larger discussions about them, and so on. So it's the repeated application of a recursive, so you're using recursion in your definition. And here's an interesting picture of recursion as well, etc. There are other aspects, though, of Kant's universal sense that we have a sense of reason. But there are problems with it in any case, and that's because not everybody fits. There are insane people, for example. There are criminals, which by definition seem to be insane. If you follow Kant, not only do these categories frame our rational perception of the world, they also frame our moral point of view. That's remember the quote that was on the APU building. Grant Hall pointed out, that the one is the way the universe is structured, but the other is the way my mind, especially with regard to my morality, is structured. And the question that typically comes up is if we're confronted with a moral dilemma, and I think I already used the one of the woman in the car in Detroit that the people just ignored while three ugly guys all tried to get to her, etc. And then eventually she jumped in the river and so on. What is it with that magpie? He's like so annoying. But
he's a pretty bird. I like him.
yeah, I don't know what the heck he's trying to accomplish here. But the idea, the question then is, what's our moral obligation in a particular moral dilemma situation? And for Kant, that works just the same as, that's a rectangle, that's a square, that's light. We all share, and automatically we'll know what our obligation is, our moral obligation is. The problem that Kant realized, though, is that just because we know what we ought to do doesn't mean we'll actually do it, because there's a lot of other reasons where we'll delay or we'll avoid. I know I should do such and such, but no, I don't want to do it. Why? Well, I could be lazy, I could be afraid, whatever, right? So we typically get into talking about Kant's sense of morality by, number one, we call it deontology. Deontology is the study of duty, and he's an example of, what your duty is. Why don't you do it? Because you intuitively know what it is. When I said that the next generation automatically started questioning how this structure could be the structure of a universal human perspective, and it broadened and became language and culture, notice that also means that your moral sense is going to be different depending on the moral norms in your community. That doesn't mean that you're sinful because you're following the norms of a different society. Kant wasn't that sophisticated culturally. He lived in Königsberg, never left it, although he lived in various homes around the suburbs. But he was offered other positions. When he was young, he was a tutor in a house that I don't know how close it was to Königsberg. But even though he was offered positions in other universities, like I think at Heidelberg, and so, he never wanted to leave. And I think part of that is because he was perhaps autistic to some extent. That's my guess. He never married. There is a French movie on Kant.
Pour le récit, deuxièmement le raisonnement, troisièmement la plaisanterie, quatrièmement.
Pigeonnier. À proprement parler, je vois.
So, sorry, this is in French.
Votre simple et profonde remarque.
But just so you know that this movie is out there, if you're curious, this is Kant in his later days. So this isn't when he's a young man, obviously. It follows all the way up to his death. So I think this is historically based, this movie. He did fire his butler because the butler decided to get married. He thought that demonstrated disloyalty to him. The butler wanted to have his own life, have a family, and so.
Do you think he had like Asperger's or something?
He did have friends. They did come over for dinner. That was his favorite thing to do, is have friends over for dinner. He was a popular teacher. His books were significant. He always walked the same route. He always had breakfast and everything exactly the same way. Even the way he laid out his clothes at night and everything, he just did everything exactly the same way, constantly.
Kind of like an automatic pilot.
Yeah. So here's an example of him walking, I guess. And notice his butler always followed him with the umbrella. So
he had money?
not that much. This is the way he would always sleep.
Sits up. It's terrifying.
Monsieur le professeur?
Est-il possible de concevoir un être humain qui jouisse d'une santé plus parfaite que moi?
Non, monsieur le professeur. Nuit.
So pretty weird.
L'entretien pas sans jeu.
But so the movie's there, if you're curious. I've got to come up with a good quiz question too. Usually what I'll ask for Kant is a moral dilemma, and like that car question, why would you get out of the car? Do you feel your moral obligation is to interfere? And what of course everyone will normally say, if we're all from the same culture, is, oh yes, our moral obligation is to interfere, but what would you actually do? And then you get a split. Some people would say, well, I would call the police, etc. Some would get out and confront the three bullies, etc. But immediately then, I would come back and point out that depending on your culture or your sex or your family situation, if you had children in the car, you know, that's certainly going to have an impact on, you know, how your feeling of your moral obligation. So Kant's wrong there too. Everything becomes, so he sets us off on this realization that there's something that structures the way we perceive the world, but then it goes on to become a matter of theories that will explain why that is. I suppose, you know, maybe a good quiz question I could ask, do you think bringing up Noam Chomsky in this context was adequate? How do I frame that? Let me show you Everett as a counterpoint to him. Nobody sleep. There are snakes. Don't sleep. There are snakes. So this is the other point of view, Daniel Everett, not Peter, who spent 20 plus years, I mean, he's still there as far as I know, living with the Piraha, which is a Amazonian village, people that had been only recently discovered, and so it was like still in their original primitive state, so to speak. And so he's studying their language, and it's that relationship that enables him to come back and say that human languages are not universal. They don't have these Chomskyan characteristics, that even those are based on environment and culture. I suppose I could ask the quiz question, you know, where do you think human nature has universal things that we share? I mean, it's pretty clear that there are things. We share the need for food, same kind of protein, and so on. We need water, we need air to breathe, we need families. But are there any cultural characteristics you think that all societies share? For Kant, there should be. For Chomsky, there is. I gather from Everett's point of view, there is not. Even with regard to things like counting plurals in sentences, one characteristic of the Piraha, for example, is that if you have, so he originally arrived not only as a linguist who wanted to study their language and their culture, but he also arrived as a Christian that wanted to convert them. And so he would tell them stories about Jesus. And their inquiry immediately was, do you know this guy, Jesus? And he said, no. And they were absolutely not interested then. They were only interested in concrete, physical individuals. And they even have, for example, a problem if someone disappears, as far as they're concerned, they're gone. And then they come back, now they're there again, right?
Why is that? They can't imagine.
Well, that's the thing.
Well, think about where they live. People disappear all the time.
Yeah, but I think more.
It's more their language is just so incapable of enabling them
Understand concept of
right,
no longer being there.
what their words.
They don't perceive it, so it's
Right. Their words are for what's visible, and yet, I mean, if don't sleep, there are snakes, which is the title of the book. They live in a place where the snakes can get you, so don't sleep. Well,
yeah.
you know, we need sleep. You know, how do you avoid sleeping? You know, is that something that, you know, that culturally they can do? It's not something, I think this group also has the same characteristic of some others that I've read about, and that is that they describe the directions they face in terms of east, west, south, north. And so, like, if I'm thinking this chair is next to me, they would instead refer to this as the chair is to my east. If I'm like this, it's still east. It's not behind me now, it's east. It's still east.
Yeah, that's strange.
You know? And now if I go over here, it's to my north, right? You know, so I think they're that way. I don't remember. I could be easily confusing that with other primitive, like New Guinea or some place where, because that might have been something that another group of people have as a characteristic, which strikes me as really odd. But it's not just one. There's like, it seems like a significant linguistic difference between even Western cultures and others, where people refer to things as a direction as opposed to, and so even like in a room, automatically still know those directions, which what I have to do is orient myself first and then do it. Apparently they don't have to orient themselves. They are always aware of the directions they're in. That's kind of weird, you know.
That could be a
I
good
suppose
trick.
birds are like
Yeah.
that. You know, birds, I would think, have to do that.
With directional, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe you know, some people I think argue that we used to be able to do that, but we lost it because we no longer needed it or something. Whereas if you're talking about folks living in the jungle, they still have absolute need of knowing where they are. And so on. So, does that seem like a pretty clear quiz question? Do we have any universal characteristics? Is that how I said that?
I guess I said that, yeah. I'm interested in that book now, though. That's.
Oh, sorry.
I said I'm interested in that book now. The Don't Sleep, There's Snakes.
Yeah, it's in the library. I didn't buy it. I read it from the library. Although I'm sure it's cheap also.
Yeah.
Because it's been. He's written other books subsequently, and there's arguments available about the universal grammar versus no universal grammar between Everett and Chomsky.
And Chomsky said it was universal, right?
Yes, yes. Universal grammar, it's one of his trademark accomplishments from, I guess, the 60s.
Now, my question is, Chomsky ever lived with some people that are so vastly different?
No.
That kind of lends Everett some credibility, I feel like, if he's actually...
Right.
Yeah.
Between the two of them, I feel like Everett is probably right in wherever the two of them are in dispute, although I often wonder if that could be that just so many of the things that Chomsky says irritates the heck out of me.
Yeah, that's fair. Excuse your opinion of what he said.
Yeah, I'm biased. And yet people say he's brilliant. He is brilliant. I mean, you know, it's just that he's so enwrapped in such a different point of view. He's brilliant about it, and he has all sorts of support for it.
Yeah.
But it just strikes me as, how can he think that way? Because,
yeah,
you know, that's just so impractical. As you know, they've tried lots of different ways of creating harmony and peace more equality and spreading the wealth, and none of that stuff ever really does any good. It always seems to just create problems that end up being worse. I mean, the Soviet Union was a perfect example of that.
It's also an extreme.
Yeah.
Which
Now
sounds
keep
like,
in
sounds
mind,
like he's
keep in mind that
insurance.
he is, I think, Ashkenazi Jewish. His parents fled Europe from the Holocaust. Even though he's 89, I got the impression from his genetics that he's liable to live to like 110.
Like those old rabbis, they claim.
Right. Yeah. So Ashkenazi genes. When you look at whose IQ is the highest.
You're just excellent for some reason.
Ashkenazi are like always at the top of the chart.
They also inbreed a lot, right?
They
In a
do
weird
what?
way. Well, I mean not inbreed, but like they
Oh,
kind of
yeah,
keep it
yeah,
within
yeah,
this
right,
relatively small community.
Right. Another example is Steven Pinker and his wife, who are both Ashkenazi. I can't think of her name offhand, but I've read several of her books too. She's a philosopher.
Yeah, that's an interesting study.
There's a gene pool that is identifiable as Ashkenazi, and they have kept it pretty tight for quite some time.
You can't marry your sister, but you can marry your second cousin.
What's it working out for him?
There was an interesting argument that the reason that they're so smart is because there's been so much attempt to kill them off in the world for the last
Couple millennia.
Yeah, and so it's weeded out the dumb ones.
Natural selection.
Yes, so that the only ones that have survived those multiple Holocausts are the smartest among them.
That's fair.
And so,
Lucky. Yeah.
Of course, traditionally they grow up in families where they're supposed to learn multiple languages and memorize the Torah and basically be scholastic
They want it, yeah.
from the very beginning. So
And they have
makes
a
them
work
scholarly
ethic
too.
that's off the charts.
Yeah.
That's why they're always so successful.